After taking control of Roanoke Island and the surrounding area, Burnside turned his attention toward another of his primary objectives, New Bern, a vital seaport for the Confederacy, transportation center, and North Carolina's former capital and second largest city. Burnside's force set sail on March 11th, stopping at Hatteras to pick up more men. New Bern's residents had anticipated that federal forces would attempt to capture their town, and many had already evacuated. The city was defended by about 4,000 Confederates under the command of Brigadier General Lawrence O'Brien Branch. Branch had built entrenchments and 7 forts to defend New Bern. The largest was Fort Thompson. The fort had 13 guns, 10 of which guarded the river, and the other 3 covered the land approaches. The Neuse River passage was defended from attacking ships by torpedoes and other obstructions, including sunken hulls.
Burnside arrived off the mouth of the Neuse River on the night of March the 12th and disembarked the next morning on the 13th. He disembarked, unloaded all of his men on the 13th, and began marching up towards New Bern. He encountered the first obstacle, which was the Croatan Works, but there was nobody there. This was supposed to be the first line of defense for New Bern, but the men had already retreated towards New Bern, and so there was nobody at the Croatan Works. They left the Croatan Works and began marching up towards New Bern, but it was raining heavily, and so they marched up in heavy rain and mud.
While the Union infantry advanced, the Federal gunboats carefully moved up the river toward the town, shelling the woods to scatter the defenders. About a half-mile below the main Confederate defensive line, the fleet engaged in a duel by artillery with Fort Dixie. That lasted until nightfall.
Burnside had about 13,000 men bivouacked in about a mile below the Confederate forces. They bivouacked that night, sleeping in the rain. Meanwhile, the Confederate forces had only 4,000 men. They slept in the rain as well. They could not have any fires, because any fires that they would have would draw artillery from the ships, the Union ships out there at in the river. So they didn't get any sleep at all, whereas the Federals did get some sleep, and they had a very rough night.
On the morning of March 14th, Burnside ordered an advance on the mile-long defensive line, which ran between Fort Thompson on the river and the Atlantic and North Carolina Railroad line. Brigadier General John Foster's brigade was on the Federal right, nearest the fort. Major General Jesse Reno advanced his men down the railroad on the Federal left flank, and Major General John Parke's brigade followed in support.
So between General Reno and General Foster is where the heavy part of the fighting took place. Then on the other side of the railroad, there was a hillside full of trees, deciduous trees, and this is where the 26th North Carolina was stationed.
The battle began with Foster's brigade attacking Fort Thompson, which also was being shelled by the Federal gunboats. The fortification's 3 land-facing guns, Confederate infantry fire, and imprecise shelling from the gunboats temporarily stalled the Union infantry's advance. However, Foster's men eventually stormed and took the fort, while another part of the brigade engaged poorly trained Confederate militia.
Many of them had squirrel guns. Many of them did not even have uniforms and had not seen any battle at all, had little training, and they fired 1 shot or maybe 2 shots and panicked.
Meanwhile, Reno advanced his men up the railroad line, putting more pressure on the defenders. With his center collapsing, Confederate General Branch ordered a withdrawal. That order didn't reach Colonel Zebulon Vance and his 26th North Carolina, who continued to engage Reno. Eventually, Vance was forced to retreat toward New Bern as Federal forces breached the defenses.
When they get to the bridge at New Bern, they find out that the bridge at New Bern is on fire, and there's no way for them to escape to New Bern. So at that point, they turn around and head to Claremont Bridge to go across the river. When they get to Claremont Bridge, they find out that that bridge too is burning. So they can't go across the bridge at Claremont. So Vance decides to get on his horse and swim across the bridge, across the river, but his horse can't do it. The horse throws him into the water, and Vance swims across the river, goes across the river, and goes about a half a mile down the road and finds a boat. Takes the boat and goes across the river and begins ferrying his forces across the river back and forth until he gets his forces on the other side of the river. At that point, they march down to Trenton, North Carolina, and from Trenton they go to Kinston.
As the Federals approached, the citizens of New Bern set fire to certain buildings and supplies in an effort to keep them out of Union hands. But the burning of cotton and turpentine was fueled by winds and set even more of the town ablaze. Official reports following the battle put the Union losses at 471 men, while Confederates counted 578 casualties. Confederates would try to retake New Bern a number of times over the next 3 years, but those attempts would fail. The key seaport would remain in Federal control for the remainder of the Civil War.